In 4 months, two Nobel Prize-winning economists lost $4.6 billion and nearly brought down the global financial system. Their math was perfect. Their models were the most advanced on Wall Street. And none of it mattered, because they forgot that people aren't math. His name was Daniel. He'd grown up watching his father chase stock tips. A neighbor's recommendation here, a newspaper column there, a broker's hunch that cost the family a summer vacation in 2007. By the time Daniel was 19, he had decided there had to be a better way to think about money. Not tips, not hunches. Certainty, or as close to certainty as math could get you. 26 years old, physics degree from a well-regarded university, a mind that processed equations the way most people process conversation. Quickly, naturally, and without real effort. So he did what a certain kind of young person does. He found the most demanding, most unforgiving corner of the financial world he could locate. He became a quant, not a trader in the movie sense. No screaming on a floor, no loosened tie, no $300 lunch. A quant sits in a quiet room, usually in front of several screens, and builds math models that answer questions like, what is the fair price of this option? How much risk is hidden inside this portfolio? If markets behave this way in normal times, what happens when things stop being normal? The field has a history that most people find surprising. Its roots go back to the early 1800s. To scientists studying the random movement of pollen particles in water, Brownian motion, it was called, nobody thought it had anything to do with money. It was a curiosity about physics. 100 years later, it became the main way we think about how stock prices move. Daniel knew all of this. He found it beautiful. He was about to find out how complicated beautiful things get when human fear walks into the room. Here is the first thing most people get wrong about this field. It is not stock picking. When Daniel's father watched the financial news and chose shares in a company because the presenter seemed sure of himself, he was making a judgment about whether a business was good, whether the people running it were capable, whether the product would work, whether the market had missed something sitting inside the numbers. Daniel didn't do any of that. What he did was closer to what a scientist does. He looked for the math relationships between things. How does the price of this contract relate to the price of the thing underneath it? How do you spread risk across a group of investments to get the best return for the least danger? If markets were unusually unpredictable in January, what does that tell us about February? The field breaks into a few main areas. Pricing complex financial products. Building systems to track how much money a company could lose under different situations. Putting together investment plans using math to balance risk against reward. What all of these share is one core idea, that financial markets are random systems. You cannot know exactly what the market will do tomorrow. But you can build tools for describing what it is likely to do, how sure you should be about that guess, and how you should act given everything you don't know. The tool that made this useful at a large scale was the Black-Scholes equation, developed in the early 1970s. It gave traders a math framework for pricing options. And in doing so, it helped kick off decades of explosive growth in financial markets around the world. Daniel understood why people loved this. What he was slower to understand was the assumption hidden inside the equation. The assumption that the people buying and selling would always act in a calm, logical way. That assumption, as it turned out, was doing a lot of heavy lifting. And the moment it broke, Daniel was going to be sitting right in the middle of it. What happened next is something he would still be thinking about 7 years later when he walked away from the career he had spent his entire adult life building toward. When Daniel got his first real job, at a mid-sized investment firm, he was given a data set and told to build a risk model for a credit portfolio. He spent 3 months on it. He tested it against old data. He stress-tested it against past crashes. The numbers were clean. The logic held up. His senior colleague looked it over and said it was solid work. 6 months later, a fairly ordinary piece of bad news in a completely different part of the market caused something unexpected. The different parts of Daniel's portfolio, which the model had treated as mostly separate, started moving in the exact same direction at the exact same time. It happened in a single afternoon. In normal times, those instruments moved independently. In the moment of panic, when fear spread and people sold everything they had, they became almost perfectly connected. Daniel sat at his desk and watched it happen in real time. The model was open on one screen, the live market data was open on another, and the gap between them was growing by the minute. He would later say it was the strangest feeling of his working life, like watching a weather forecast confidently show sunshine while rain hammered the windows outside. The forecast wasn't lying. It was just describing a world that no longer existed. The math had been right about the world when things were calm. It had been wrong about the world that shows up when people are scared. This lesson has been learned again and again at enormous cost since the 1970s. In 1987, Black Monday, strategies built by quants to protect against losses instead made them worse. When enough people are running the same model and it tells them all to sell at the same moment, the model destroys itself. In 1998, long-term capital management, Nobel Prize winners, perfect math on paper. Complete collapse when the models ran into things they had said were nearly impossible. In 2007 and 2008, the global financial crisis. Loan packages priced by models that assumed American house prices had never fallen across the whole country and never would. They did. The models weren't stupid. The people who built them weren't stupid. But there is a difference between a system that describes normal times very well and a system that can handle what happens when human beings panic. Math is very good at the first. It has real limits with the second. Daniel began to see this not as a failure, but as the most important question in the whole field. And it changed everything about what he did next. He had been offered a senior role, more money, a bigger portfolio, the kind of step up that most people in his world would have taken without a second thought. He sat with it for 2 weeks. He thought about it the way he thought about everything. What were the real odds this would make him happy? What was he actually signing up for? What were the costs that didn't show up on the surface? He turned it down. Not because the job wasn't good. Because he had started to see that the most important money decisions most people ever make have almost nothing to do with financial models. They have everything to do with the same emotional forces that had broken his model that afternoon. Fear, too much confidence, the very human inability to stay calm when money is moving fast in the wrong direction. And nobody was explaining that in a way that normal people could actually use. That decision cost him something. It cost him the career his training had been pointing toward for 6 years. But it was also, he would later say, the first financial decision he had made that he fully understood. If this is landing somewhere useful for you, hit the like button and subscribe. It takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps other people find this kind of content. What Daniel carried out of that choice and into the work he did next were 5 things that the world of quantitative finance had taught him the hard way, and every single one of them applies to anyone who has ever had to make a money decision, which is every adult alive. The first lesson: uncertainty is not the enemy. Overconfidence is. Think about it this way. A weather forecaster who says there is a 70% chance of rain is being honest. A forecaster who says it will definitely rain is not being more accurate. They are being less honest. And here is the thing. The second forecaster sounds better. They sound more useful, more certain, more like someone who actually knows what they are talking about. But certainty and accuracy are not the same thing. They never were. And in financial markets, the gap between the two has cost people more money than almost anything else. The people who failed most badly in financial history were not the ones who admitted they didn't know what would happen next. They were the ones who were so sure their models had the answer that they stopped treating their guesses as guesses. The takeaway: be careful around financial certainty. Anyone. An advisor, a presenter, an app, your own gut, who tells you a financial outcome is basically guaranteed is either wrong or selling something. Good money decisions start with being honest about what you don't know. The second lesson. Spreading your money only helps if you're actually spreading it. When things are calm, different types of investments move differently. When things get bad, they tend to all fall at the same time. Daniel had a colleague who used to say he was well diversified because he owned a dozen different investment funds. What he actually owned Once you looked inside each fund was a slightly different arrangement of the same large company stocks. When the market dropped, every single fund dropped with it. He had spread his money across 12 folders. He had not spread his risk across 12 different things. This is what people in 2008 discovered when it was too late. Owning 10 different bank funds wasn't spreading risk. It was the same bet 10 times over. The takeaway: real spreading of risk means owning things that are genuinely different from each other, not just different names for the same thing, and not different funds that are all holding the same underlying stocks. It is one of the most powerful things you can do with your money, but only if it is actually doing what it says. The third lesson: the difference between losing some money and losing everything is how much you bet on one thing. There is a pattern that comes up again and again in financial disasters, and it is not what most people expect. It is not that the person was wrong. It is that they were right, and put everything on it anyway. A trader Daniel knew early in his career had correctly spotted something unusual in the market. His thinking was sound. The trade paid off. But he had put so much of his money into it that the wild price moves along the way, before the payoff arrived, wiped him out before he could collect. He was right about what would happen. He just couldn't hold on long enough to benefit from it. He lost nearly everything on a call he got correct. The takeaway: no single money decision. No single stock, no single house, no single business should be able to destroy your financial life on its own. How much you put into any one thing matters just as much as whether that thing turns out to be a good idea. The fourth lesson: what goes way up tends to come back down, and what falls hard tends to recover. Daniel watched this play out in the years after the 2008 crash. Colleagues who had sold everything near the bottom, convinced things would never recover, watched from the sidelines as markets came all the way back and kept going. People who had bought heavily near the top, convinced things could only go higher, held through years of losses waiting to get back to where they started. Both groups were reacting to the same feeling, the feeling that whatever is happening right now will keep happening. And the reason this keeps happening is not that these people were foolish. It is that the feeling is convincing. When everything is falling, selling feels like the smart move. When everything is rising, buying more feels like the obvious move. The feeling and the right decision almost always point in opposite directions. And the feeling almost always wins, unless you already know to expect it. The takeaway: when everyone around you is sure something will go up forever, that is a reason to be careful. When everyone is sure something will never recover, that is often a reason to be patient. Chasing what has already risen or selling in fear when something has fallen almost always works against you over time. Knowing that, and actually behaving differently because of it, is one of the hardest and most valuable things a person can learn about money. The fifth lesson: if you can't explain it simply, you probably shouldn't own it. Before the 2008 crisis, there were people working at major financial firms whose job was to manage risk on huge collections of complex loan products. Some of them, if you had stopped them in the hallway and asked them to explain exactly what was inside those products, where the loans came from, what standards were used to approve them, could not have given you a clear answer, not because they were lazy, because the products had been built in so many layers that the truth of what was inside them had become genuinely hard to see. That complexity wasn't an accident. It made the products easier to sell and harder to question. And when the reality inside finally showed up, all that complexity offered no protection. It had only pushed the moment of reckoning further down the road. And here is the part that is easy to miss. This was not a story about bad people or even bad math. It was a story about what happens when something is designed to be hard to question. And nobody stops to ask why. The takeaway: if you cannot explain. In plain, simple words, what a financial product is actually doing with your money and what could go wrong with it, you should not own it. The most dangerous financial products in history were not the simple ones. The best money decisions are usually the ones you can describe to a 12-year-old. 7 years passed. Daniel got very good at this work. He also got very clear-eyed about what it could and couldn't do. He didn't leave because the field let him down. He left because he had done what he always did: run the numbers on his own situation honestly. And the answer pointed somewhere else. He became, as he put it, a translator. His job was to take what he had learned about uncertainty, about panic, about the way fear breaks systems built on the assumption of calm, and put it into language that people with mortgages, retirement accounts, savings goals, and money fears could actually use. He used to tell a story about his father, not the man who chased stock tips. The man his father slowly became after a long series of honest conversations about how markets actually work. Daniel remembered the specific moment the shift started. They were talking one evening about a stock his father had bought on a friend's recommendation, and instead of asking whether it would go up, his father had paused and said, "Wait. What would have to be true for this to actually work out?" That was a different question. That was the beginning. And then later, much later, his father sat at a kitchen table late one night, the house quiet around him, and said, "I think I've been treating uncertainty like a problem to fix." And Daniel said, "It's not. It's just the water we all swim in. You just have to get better at swimming." His father never became a quant. He became something more useful. Someone who could make a money decision without needing to be sure of the outcome first. The math helped him get there, not by removing the uncertainty, by making it visible. Quantitative finance is one of the hardest careers in the world to get into. The math is brutal. The hours are long. The competition is relentless. But the things it teaches about risk, about confidence, about the gap between what we think we know and what we actually know, those don't belong to the people who work in that world. They belong to anyone willing to think honestly about money. Long-term capital management didn't fail because the math was bad. It failed because the people running it stopped treating their model as a model and started treating it as the truth. A model is not the world. It is a map. Maps are useful, sometimes essential. But the map doesn't change when the territory does. The most dangerous moment in any money decision is when you stop treating what you believe as a belief and start treating it as a fact. That is when things break. That is when the money goes. And that is when the world reminds you it was never going to ask your permission first. I'm Billy, and I probably spend too much time thinking about why people who are smart about most things make the same money mistakes over and over. And why the most useful thing anyone ever taught me about finance had nothing to do with picking the right stock or finding the right fund. It was just learning to tell the difference between what I actually know and what I only think I know. If that strikes a chord, the next video is already on your screen. Go watch it and subscribe for more.